Welcome back to Fatal Files. Today, I've gathered some of the absolute worst, most evil revenge deaths you could imagine. From a group of toxic roommates who trapped their prankster friend inside a sleeper couch as sick payback, to a brutally jealous ex-boyfriend who sabotaged a motorcycle's brakes, leaving a deadly trap just waiting to spring. It was February 18th, 2015, in a quiet rental duplex outside Columbus, Ohio. Snow from the previous weekend still sat in dirty piles along the curb, while cold wind rattled the basement windows. Inside the house, music, beer bottles, and old gaming consoles made the night feel completely normal. Kyle Morez was 23 years old and taking classes at a local community college while working part-time unloading delivery trucks. Most people knew Kyle as the funny guy who always needed attention. The problem was that Kyle never really knew when to stop. If somebody looked embarrassed, that usually just made the prank funnier to him. Kyle treated the duplex like his own prank channel long before prank videos became common online. He hid roommates' shoes in dumpsters, swapped shampoo with dish soap, and once glued a shaving cream nozzle shut so it exploded across his roommate's face before work. And I think that's the part that would have annoyed me the most. Kyle didn't just want the reaction in the moment. He wanted something he could replay and laugh at afterward. At first, his roommates, Mason and Eric, tried laughing it off, but after months of being filmed, embarrassed, and turned into the punchline of Kyle's online videos, the resentment inside that house started building fast. One prank ended with Mason showing up late to a job interview covered in shaving cream. Another got Eric recognized at school after classmates passed around Kyle's videos. By that point, this wasn't roommates joking around anymore. They genuinely wanted to embarrass Kyle back the same way he'd embarrassed them. A week before the incident, Kyle uploaded another prank compilation online. One clip showed Mason and Eric walking straight into duct tape stretched across their bedroom doorway, sending them stumbling into the hallway while Kyle laughed behind the camera. And because of that, even strangers at school started recognizing them. And I can definitely see here why the roommates stopped finding any of it funny anymore. According to investigators, friends later said the roommates had spent days talking about pranking Kyle back. The duplex basement still had an old fold-out sleeper sofa with a heavy spring-loaded steel frame that snapped shut hard if the locking bar wasn't secured properly. Kyle often slept on it while gaming, so during a Friday night of drinking and playing games downstairs, Mason eventually joked about stuffing Kyle into the same couch he always crashed on. Everyone laughed, even Kyle. Then, Eric grabbed the steel frame handle. To them, it was just revenge disguised as another prank. While Kyle was distracted, Mason and Eric suddenly lifted the mattress frame upward together. Kyle rolled toward the center crease and laughed at first, clearly expecting them to stop. Instead, the heavy frame snapped shut around him with a violent metallic slam. Inside the couch, Kyle's chest and shoulders became pinned against the steel bars, making it difficult to breathe or push himself free. Investigators later found bent springs, showing how hard he struggled inside the frame. At first, the roommates thought he was still playing along. The couch shook while muffled yelling came from inside the cushions, but after a minute, the movements became weaker. Mason joked that Kyle was finally getting a taste of his own pranks, while Eric recorded part of it on his phone. What finally changed the mood was when Eric noticed liquid running from beneath the cushions, and Mason heard a low choking sound before everything suddenly stopped. When they pulled the couch open, Kyle was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived shortly afterward, but he was pronounced dead after being transported to the hospital. Authorities later concluded the roommates never intended to kill Kyle, but prosecutors argued the prank became criminal once they ignored clear signs he was in distress. Both later accepted plea deals for involuntary manslaughter. It was September 9th, 2017, in Irvine, California. The afternoon was warm and dry, with clear skies over a quiet residential block. Rows of identical houses, trimmed lawns, and empty driveways. Nothing that suggested anything unusual had already been set in motion. Daniel Hurst is the kind of person you'd probably describe as disciplined the moment you met him. He was 45, an architect who had stepped away from his firm to work from home, and everything about his life reflected that mindset. Structured, measured, controlled. He lived with his partner, Elise, who was 38, and from the outside, nothing about their situation stood out as unusual. But then something small started to slip. It showed up in his security logs, just a simple entry: Someone accessing the house in the middle of the day at a time Daniel wasn't supposed to be home. That alone could have been nothing, maybe a glitch, but it didn't stop there. It kept happening, always within the same narrow window, repeating often enough that it stopped feeling random and started looking deliberate. Eventually, there was a name tied to those entries: Marco Inez, a 41-year-old delivery driver assigned to the route. Now this is the part that really stands out, because most people would confront it immediately. There would be questions, arguments, something reactive, but Daniel didn't do any of that. He didn't confront Elise, and he didn't confront Marco. Instead, he kept the logs and watched the pattern continue, almost like he was studying it, letting it become predictable. That kind of silence feels more unsettling than anger, because it suggests something is building rather than breaking. At some point, while all of this was still happening, the garage renovation began. On paper, it looked standard, but what was built didn't match typical residential construction. The slab was dug deeper than necessary, and a reinforced steel grid was installed underneath in a way that didn't make sense for a normal home. Materials were delivered over several weeks, but no contractors were ever listed, and neighbors later said they heard work at night without ever seeing a crew. What makes it worse is that during that entire period, the visits didn't stop. They continued on the same schedule, unchanged, like nothing else had shifted. Then one day, Daniel stayed home. Around midday, Marco's delivery truck pulled up just like it always had. There's footage from across the street showing him walking to the front door and going inside, and nothing about it looks unusual in the moment, but he was never seen leaving. Inside the house, whatever happened unfolded quickly. Marco sustained severe blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object, and the damage was immediately fatal. Elise's injuries were different, involving multiple stab wounds to the upper torso that caused rapid blood loss and damage to vital organs, leading to death within a short time frame. What stands out is that there were no signs of a struggle extending into the rest of the house, no widespread disturbance, nothing that suggested chaos. Both of them were moved into the garage. That same afternoon, a truck delivered pre-mixed concrete, and the driver later stated that Daniel directed the entire pour himself without any crew assisting. The concrete was poured in one continuous layer, smooth and uninterrupted, filling the reinforced structure beneath the garage floor. Based on the reconstruction, both bodies had already been placed inside that structure before the pour began, and there were no signs of movement in the material. 2 days later, Elise was reported missing, and at first, nothing inside the house raised suspicion. That changed when investigators reviewed the renovation permit and noticed the garage measurements didn't match standard construction. Scans revealed irregularities beneath the floor, and once excavation began, both bodies were recovered from the reinforced slab. The medical examiner confirmed Marco died from blunt force trauma, while Elise died from multiple stab wounds. The concrete played no role in their deaths. It was used purely to conceal them. Daniel was found 3 days later at another property he owned and didn't resist arrest. Financial records showed he had already moved money in the days before, suggesting preparation. In court, the focus was on how deliberate everything was: the construction, the timing, and the execution. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. It was February 2018 in Denver, Colorado. The commercial district sat several blocks from the main stretch of downtown, a cluster of mid-rise office buildings that filled up on weekday mornings and emptied out by early evening. Most people who worked there kept to themselves between floors. Naomi Sheld was 33 years old and worked as a marketing strategist at a boutique brand agency. She was efficient and precise and had positioned herself well within the agency over several years. People who worked alongside her remembered her differently. She took credit for junior colleagues' work in client presentations, manipulated internal documentation during disputes, and used her relationship with agency leadership to sideline anyone she viewed as a threat. One of those people was Tilda Roeck, 33, a childhood friend who had landed at the same agency in their mid-20s. In 2013, they developed a brand pitch together over several months. When the time came to present it, Naomi submitted it under her name alone, The client signed, and Naomi's career accelerated while Tilda was quietly pushed out within the year. The fallout was severe. Within months of leaving the agency, Tilda experienced a depressive episode that required several months of inpatient treatment. During that period, she lost her apartment and the relationship she had been in for 4 years. By the time she was discharged, she was rebuilding her life from the scratch, taking junior roles she was overqualified for, while Naomi continued advancing at the agency on work they had originally developed together. In early 2017, Tilda contacted Naomi under the pretense of reconnecting after the death of a mutual friend. Naomi welcomed the outreach without suspicion. Over the following months, Tilda visited the office occasionally, bringing coffee or lunch and helping with small tasks. Her presence became familiar enough that Naomi eventually gave her a spare access card for days she was tied up in meetings, and other staff paid little attention to her visits. Investigators later examined Tilda's access to Naomi's office routine. Records showed she had spent months researching serotonin syndrome, a condition that can occur when certain supplements are combined with antidepressant medications and push serotonin levels beyond what the body can regulate. In severe cases, the reaction can become fatal. Naomi had been prescribed a standard SSRI, and investigators noted that the addition of certain over-the-counter serotonergic supplements could create a dangerous interaction. Purchase records showed that 2 supplements commonly used in wellness products had been ordered online in the months before Naomi's death. Investigators believed small amounts may have been introduced into Naomi's protein powder through the office drawer where she kept it, a drawer Tilda had access to during her visits. Their theory was that small amounts were added during earlier visits before the concentration was increased shortly before the incident. Naomi never reported noticing anything unusual. In the weeks before the incident, Naomi mentioned to a colleague that she had been feeling unusually warm and restless during the day. She attributed it to caffeine and cut back on coffee. She said the same during a conversation with Tilda, who suggested she try to get more rest. On a Thursday morning in February, Naomi prepared her protein shake at her desk as she did every day. Within about 90 minutes, she appeared visibly unwell, sweating heavily and struggling to focus on a routine task. She stood to walk toward the restroom and collapsed in the open area between desks. 2 colleagues reached her within seconds, while another called for assistance. Her body temperature was dangerously elevated, her muscles rigid, and she experienced severe tremors lasting several minutes. Naomi remained conscious, but unable to control the movements. She was transported to the hospital. Naomi died later that day from complications associated with serotonin syndrome. Building access logs and colleague accounts confirmed that Tilda had visited the office the afternoon before the incident. The protein powder in Naomi's desk later tested positive for added serotonergic compounds. Tilda was interviewed twice and identified as a person of interest, but investigators were unable to obtain a confession or direct evidence linking her to the purchase or placement of the supplements. The case stalled and no charges were filed. The investigation remained open within the period covered by available records. It was August 3rd, 2017, in Topeka, Kansas. The temperature climbed to 92 degrees beneath a cloudless sky. The residential street sat mostly silent, except for the steady hum of cicadas and the occasional passing car. Lawn sprinklers clicked rhythmically across trimmed yards, while heat shimmered above asphalt driveways. Bendix Spink, 42, a delivery driver known for punctuality and strict routine, had been mowing his lawn for more than an hour. He worked in straight, deliberate lines, wearing the same faded blue cap he wore every weekend. Neighbors described him as reserved but polite. For 6 months, tension had grown between Bendix and the man next door, Gareth Lyle, 38. Their conflict centered on repeated complaints Bendix made about vehicles speeding through the neighborhood. Police had responded to verbal disputes between the two at least 3 times. Neighbors later told investigators the arguments had become more frequent and more hostile in the weeks leading up to August. During yard work, Bendix followed a predictable habit. A clear gallon water jug sat on a small table on his shaded porch beside a metal folding chair. Every 20 minutes, he would pause, drink, and return to mowing. The jug was always there. 2 days earlier, Gareth Lyle had purchased antifreeze from a local hardware store. Surveillance footage confirmed the transaction. The product contained ethylene glycol as its active ingredient and, investigators later noted, did not include a detectable bittering agent. Doorbell camera footage captured what happened next. While Bendix worked in the backyard, Gareth approached the porch carrying an identical clear-gallon jug. The liquid inside appeared nearly clear, a diluted mixture of antifreeze and water that looked no different from what had been there before. He removed Bendix's original jug and replaced it with the substitute. The exchange took less than 30 seconds. He walked away without hesitation. After finishing the front section of lawn, Bendix returned to the porch. Sweating heavily, he lifted the jug and drank deeply. He paused briefly, as if registering a faint sweetness, then drank again. Ethylene glycol has a mildly sweet taste, something that can easily go unnoticed in extreme heat and dehydration. He set the jug down, wiped his forehead, and resumed mowing along the driveway. Approximately 40 minutes later, early symptoms began. Ethylene glycol initially acts as a central nervous system depressant. The camera footage showed Bendix moving more slowly as he re-entered frame. His steps were uneven, his posture slumped. He gripped the porch railing and attempted to steady himself before reaching for the door. His hand slipped. He collapsed near the welcome mat. A woman walking her dog witnessed the fall and immediately called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes and transported him to the hospital. He was unresponsive but still breathing, his respiration shallow. In the emergency department, physicians noted unexplained neurological depression and abnormal blood chemistry. Laboratory results revealed a severe high anion gap metabolic acidosis, a hallmark indicator of toxic alcohol ingestion. Toxicology testing confirmed elevated ethylene glycol levels. Despite immediate antidotal therapy and aggressive supportive treatment, the metabolic acidosis progressed. Over the next 24 hours, Bendix's kidney function deteriorated rapidly as toxic metabolites accumulated in his system. Acute renal failure developed within the documented 24 to 72-hour window typical of ethylene glycol poisoning. He remained in critical condition overnight and died the following afternoon from complications of confirmed toxic exposure. Investigators secured the doorbell footage and reconstructed the timeline. Testing of the remaining liquid confirmed ethylene glycol. A search of Gareth Lyle's garage uncovered an opened antifreeze container purchased 2 days earlier, its contents matching the poison in the jug. Prior police reports documenting repeated disputes between the two men, along with the recorded jug exchange, established motive and premeditation. Gareth Lyle was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors presented surveillance footage, toxicology findings, and purchase records establishing deliberate poisoning. The jury returned a guilty verdict, and he was sentenced to life in prison under state guidelines. It was January 22, 2018, in a quiet residential neighborhood in Killeen, Texas. Cool, dry winter air and thin cloud cover left the streets still and lightly trafficked, with closely spaced homes and fenced patios typical of the area. Captain Elias Rowe, 45, lived in one of those homes. A career military officer who had spent years rotating through overseas assignments, he kept a structured daily routine and was known for strict adherence to regulations both on and off duty. Neighbors often saw him maintaining equipment or repairing tools in his backyard, habits carried over from his years in service. Earlier that day, he had been outside servicing yard equipment on his back patio, leaving several tools on a small outdoor table, including a folding utility knife he had used to cut packaging and trim material. After finishing, he went back inside, leaving the items where they were. Records later showed that a former subordinate, Victor Hale, had traveled into the neighborhood that afternoon following a long-standing grievance tied to a disciplinary report from an overseas assignment. Travel logs and phone data confirmed he drove directly to Rowe's address, and a driveway security camera captured his arrival and approach to the front of the house. Not long after Hale's arrival, Rowe exited the house, likely responding to the unexpected visit. The two men moved toward the side of the house and into the patio area, out of the direct view of the front camera. Investigators determined from disturbed furniture and scuff marks that a confrontation began almost immediately. Hale admitted he initiated physical contact, and bruising patterns supported that a punch was thrown before the two began grappling at close range. During the struggle, they collided with the patio table. Tools and loose items fell onto the concrete, including the folding utility knife. Forensic placement of the objects and blood patterns indicated Rowe reached down and picked up the knife while both men were still in close contact. Hale then attempted to control Rowe's arm. The two struggled over the knife for several seconds, shifting position across only a few feet of patio space. Forensic analysis suggested the knife may have changed hands during that struggle. At extremely close distance, the blade entered Rowe's abdomen. The wound track, confirmed by the medical examiner, penetrated deep into the abdominal cavity and severed major blood vessels. The injury would have caused rapid internal bleeding and a sharp drop in blood pressure within minutes. Rowe lost balance and collapsed onto the patio surface. The knife fell nearby as Hale stepped back and moved toward the side gate, leaving the immediate area instead of remaining with him. Moments later, a neighboring resident returning home noticed movement near the fence line and saw Hale attempting to leave the property. The neighbor's presence and shouted questions caused Hale to stop, drawing attention to the scene behind him where Rowe lay unresponsive on the concrete. The neighbor immediately contacted emergency services after recognizing the severity of the injury. Blood volume at the scene and the medical findings later indicated the wound was already critical by that point. Emergency personnel arrived and transported Rowe to a local medical facility, but he was pronounced dead shortly afterward due to massive internal hemorrhage from the abdominal stab wound. Investigators recovered the folding utility knife, displaced tools, and driveway footage, while phone messages and travel records confirmed Hale had initiated the confrontation. Forensic analysis determined the stabbing occurred during a close contact struggle rather than a planned attack with a weapon brought to the scene. Authorities charged Hale with manslaughter, concluding the retaliatory confrontation escalated into a fatal fight using a tool already present on the patio. Captain Elias Rowe died at the facility from internal bleeding caused by the abdominal wound. The investigation concluded after forensic reconstruction and recorded communications confirmed the sequence of events. Victor Hale was later convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 11 years in state prison, closing the case surrounding the retaliatory confrontation that escalated into a fatal struggle on the patio. It was May 30th, 2017, in a suburban area of Texas. Evening heat lingered over a one-story commercial strip where a mid-sized fitness center faced a busy road behind wide panes of glass. Inside, the lights stayed on long after closing. The manager often trained alone once the last members had left. Shane Becker, 41, managed the gym and oversaw nearly 900 active memberships. Months earlier, a 17-year-old member reported being assaulted in the women's locker room by a maintenance worker who claimed to be cleaning after hours. Her father, Brett Marsh, 43, confronted Shane immediately. Records later showed the incident was handled internally. The employee was quietly terminated, and the family signed a non-disclosure agreement that included compensation and free membership. No police report was filed. Within weeks, the former worker found another job at a nearby fitness facility. Friends later said Brett believed the decision had allowed the man to continue working around potential victims. Over the following months, Brett continued visiting the gym and learned Shane's routine. After closing, Shane often trained alone in the lower-level weight room, accessed by a side entrance that accepted member keycards. Security footage later showed a hooded individual entering through that door at 8:33 p.m. on a Tuesday evening and heading directly toward a leg extension machine. The person remained there for several minutes before leaving. Later examination revealed the selector pin had been filed nearly halfway through and the seat adjustment bolts had been loosened just enough to appear secure. At 8:50 p.m., Shane began his usual workout. The building was quiet. Overhead lights reflected in a large wall mirror positioned roughly 2 feet in front of the machine. After a warm-up, he set the weight to 190 pounds, a load he had used many times before. The first repetitions felt normal, though the seat shifted slightly. On the third lift, the weakened pin snapped. The weight stack crashed down, and the sudden loss of resistance caused his legs to drop hard as the lever arm swung loose, throwing off his balance rather than striking with force. Instinctively, he tried to stand, grabbing for stability. The loosened seat shifted suddenly beneath him, causing him to lose his footing and stumble forward. He moved toward the mirror. His shoulder struck first, fracturing the tempered glass into small, jagged fragments that scattered across the floor. As he fell into the broken mirror frame and shattered glass, a sharp edge cut deeply into the left side of his neck. Shane collapsed to the floor amid debris and bent metal, losing strength within minutes as blood pooled beneath him. His phone slid under the frame of the machine, out of reach. The gym remained silent until cleaning staff arrived shortly after dawn and discovered him. Investigators reviewed security footage and identified the key card used during the late-night entry as belonging to Brett Marsh. Tool marks on the failed pin matched a metal file later recovered from his garage, and filings collected from the machine corresponded to debris found on his workbench. During questioning, Brett admitted returning to the gym that night, but denied intending to kill anyone, saying he wanted Shane to be injured and held accountable for the earlier cover-up. Prosecutors argued the modifications were deliberate and designed to cause catastrophic failure under heavy load. The death was ruled a homicide. Brett was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison. Civil litigation uncovered internal emails confirming the original assault had been handled privately, and the fitness center eventually closed its doors. Months later, additional victims came forward against the former maintenance worker, leading to separate criminal charges that finally brought the earlier incident into public record. It was February 9, 2013, inside a shipyard in Mobile, Alabama. Cold air rolled through the loading docks every time the hull doors opened, mixing with the smell of grease, burnt metal, and welding smoke trapped inside the steel compartments. Crews were still working long after midnight, trying to finish repairs. Trent Holloway was 32 years old and had spent most of his life working welding jobs. Around the shipyard, he had a reputation for being skilled, fast, and miserable to train under if you were new. And honestly, the way former co-workers described him, it sounded less like harmless joking and more like somebody who liked watching people panic. According to co-workers, Trent's favorite prank involved secretly messing with welding visors before jobs started. Sometimes he swapped lenses. Other times, he partly covered the shield so apprentices suddenly couldn't see once sparks started flying. Several workers later admitted they stopped reporting it because supervisors rarely did anything beyond verbal warnings. Trent called them blind weld jokes, but around live arcs, cutting torches, and gas lines, they were incredibly dangerous. And the worst part was that Trent usually filmed the reactions afterward like the whole thing was entertainment instead of a shipyard full of things that could kill somebody in seconds. One apprentice named Gabe Mercer became Trent's favorite target after nearly burning through a live pipe during one of the pranks. The video spread around the yard for weeks, and older welders started calling Gabe Stevie Wonder every time he walked through the bay. According to co-workers, Gabe eventually started avoiding the break room just to escape the mocking. After months of watching Trent gain attention, Gabe started talking about making his own channel. Co-workers later said Gabe joked that filming Trent looking stupid might also boost his channel followers. On the night of February 9th, crews were working inside a cramped ship hull filled with welding sparks and oxygen lines. Before the shift, Gabe smeared anti-spatter gel mixed with grease around Trent's visor, causing the sparks to distort his vision. He also hid his phone nearby, planning to record Trent struggling on the job. Almost immediately, Trent started fighting with the visor while nearby workers laughed. Frustrated and partially blinded, he stepped backward without checking behind him and hooked his boot under one of the oxygen hoses. The lines snapped loose near the cutting station, releasing a high-pressure stream of oxygen into the compartment while Trent's welding arc was still active. The oxygen rapidly intensified the fire around the sparks, causing flames to race across Trent's jacket and clothing almost instantly. Workers outside the hull later described hearing a loud pop before flames pushed through the hatch opening. Trent tried tearing the gear off his body. The fabric had already melted against his skin. By the time nearby workers dragged him outside, he had suffered severe burns across his chest, neck, and arms. He stayed conscious long enough to complain that his throat felt like it was closing before dying 2 days later from burn and inhalation injuries. After the incident, the shipyard was fined for multiple safety violations, including unsecured gas lines and poor enforcement of prank complaints. Gabe was later charged with criminal negligence after investigators recovered the phone footage he had hidden near the work area. He eventually accepted a plea deal and lost his welding certification permanently. It was March 14, 2016, in a quiet duplex neighborhood in Tampa. The street was still, with only the sound of running water and early routines starting behind closed doors. Nothing stood out, nothing felt off, and that's what made it easy to miss that something had already changed overhead. One of the residents was Leonard Pike, 52. He worked maintenance at a storage facility and lived alone after his divorce. His routine was strict, and small disruptions tended to stick with him. The dog next door became one of those. It barked early in the mornings, sometimes late at night, and Leonard didn't let it pass. He complained repeatedly, knocked on the wall, and on a few occasions was heard telling Marissa to silence it. Over time, it stopped sounding like a complaint and started sounding personal. Living next door was Marissa Cole, 47. After losing her husband, she kept a low profile, and the dog had been the only constant left from that part of her life. The tension between them built slowly, but didn't ease. Then the dog died suddenly, suspected of poisoning. No clear proof, no charges, but the timing, the history of complaints, and the way the conflict had escalated pointed in one direction. Honestly, I can't imagine what that must have felt like for her. It wasn't just about noise anymore. It was the one thing she still had, suddenly gone, and no one held accountable. Neighbors later said Marissa changed after the dog died. She spoke less, stayed inside more, and reacted differently whenever Leonard's name came up. The conflict didn't ease. It shifted. What started as complaints became something tied to loss, and nothing ever resolved it. That morning, Leonard followed his usual routine. He woke before 6, turned on the water heater, and stepped into the shower. The bathroom had no active ventilation running that morning, just a closed space where heat and steam would build quickly once the shower started. At first, everything worked normally. Water pressure stayed steady, heat built up, and steam formed along the walls. Nothing seemed out of place. There were no signs of forced entry, but the bathroom had been accessed earlier that morning while Leonard was out. Later findings confirmed that a chemical substance had been placed inside the bathroom before the incident, concentrated near the shower area. Residue found at the scene showed it was already present before the water was turned on. When the shower was turned on, the heat and steam accelerated the release of fumes from the substance already present inside the enclosed bathroom. With no ventilation running, the concentration increased quickly. It likely started with irritation, burning in the eyes, a scratchy throat, then coughing and tightness in the chest. With no ventilation, the air got worse quickly. Within minutes, breathing became difficult, and the steam made it hard to even see the exit. Physical evidence showed Leonard tried to leave. He moved toward the exit, but his coordination failed. He slipped on the wet tile, struck the tub, and pulled part of the curtain and rack down with him. The water continued running, and the bathroom stayed enclosed, trapping heat and air. By midday, Leonard hadn't reported to work, which was unusual for him. A co-worker tried calling but got no response. Around the same time, a neighbor reported hearing water running continuously from his unit since early morning. The landlord entered just after 1 p.m. The bathroom door was partly closed, and the water was still running. The air inside carried a strong chemical odor. Leonard was found on the floor near the tub. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but he was already dead. The medical examiner confirmed chemical inhalation as the cause of death. The gas had damaged the airway and lungs, preventing effective oxygen exchange. Minor skin irritation was noted, but the primary cause was respiratory failure due to toxic exposure. Investigators traced the source to the bathroom itself. Chemical residue was found concentrated around the shower area, confirming the substance had been placed directly inside the enclosed space prior to use. Surveillance placed Marissa near Leonard's unit in the days before the incident, carrying a container consistent with the substance used. She was arrested 2 weeks later and charged with first-degree murder and utility tampering. Investigators cited premeditation based on repeated access and method. She was found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. It was October 2017 in Las Vegas, Nevada. The underground parking structure beneath a commercial property in the city's outer district sat 2 levels below street level and had no functioning camera system. Aldous Fenrick was 63 years old and had spent 3 decades acquiring and developing commercial real estate across Nevada and Arizona. He restructured verbal agreements after the fact, and used litigation as a pressure tool against smaller partners, cultivating a reputation that discouraged most people from pursuing losses against him. Gareth Scood was 51 and had been Aldis's development partner on a commercial property since 2015. He had invested the majority of his personal savings into the venture, taken out a second mortgage on his home, and structured his entire financial position around the expected returns. He had a daughter in college whose tuition he was covering and a wife managing a recent health diagnosis. The project was not a business decision for Gareth. It was everything he had. In early 2017, Gareth discovered that Aldis had been redirecting rental income into a private management company he controlled exclusively, an arrangement that had never appeared in their partnership documentation. Two attorneys confirmed recovery would be expensive and uncertain. Gareth could not afford to pursue it. By mid-2017, he had missed 2 mortgage payments and withdrawn his daughter from her college program without telling her why. His wife's medical expenses were going unpaid. He contacted Aldis in October and requested a private meeting. Aldis suggested the garage level of the property after hours, a location they had used before for walkthroughs. Gareth arrived first with documentation of the diverted income, intending to present it and demand a resolution. He had no plan beyond the confrontation itself. Aldis arrived and reviewed the documents without engaging their substance, told Gareth the figures were being misread, and moved toward the exit. Gareth stepped forward and grabbed his arm. Aldis shoved him hard with both hands. Gareth stumbled, recovered, and grabbed Aldis's jacket. In the struggle that followed, both men moved in a tight space between parked vehicles and a concrete wall. Aldis grabbed Gareth by the collar and drove him sideways. The momentum shifted and Aldis lost his footing, his throat making direct contact with the upper edge of a concrete utility shelf bracket fixed to the wall at shoulder height. Aldis's hands went to his throat. He made no sound. The impact caused catastrophic damage to his larynx, obstructing his airway. Gareth stepped back. Aldis slid down the wall and settled at its base, his chest moving in increasingly shallow intervals for less than 2 minutes. He was conscious for most of it, his eyes open and fixed on Gareth, fully aware of what was happening and unable to stop it. Gareth stood and watched. He did not call for help. A maintenance worker at the far end of the garage had heard the impact, opened his door several minutes later, observed Gareth standing alone near a figure on the ground, and retreated back inside. Gareth left the garage without calling for assistance. The maintenance worker contacted emergency services after Gareth's vehicle exited. Gareth was identified through entry logs and interviewed the following morning. He described the contact as mutual and unintentional. The maintenance worker's account contradicted him directly, and a medical examiner confirmed the laryngeal injury was consistent with directed impact against a hard edge rather than an incidental fall. Gareth was charged with involuntary manslaughter. Prosecutors argued that the confrontation and resulting impact constituted a reckless act that led directly to Aldis's death. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in state prison. He had served just over a year at the close of the period covered by available records. It was May 21st, 2016, in Savannah, Georgia. Warm air lingered over the historic district as evening settled across brick storefronts and narrow streets. Inside a renovated ballroom near the riverfront, a wedding reception was underway. Decorative string lights traced the perimeter of the dance floor, mounted along waist-high metal railings that separated guests from a slightly raised seating area. The space glowed amber under suspended bulbs, and the hum of conversation blended with music from the DJ's speakers. Cora Velt, 29, had ended a relationship 8 months earlier with Evan Maddox, 31. Friends later told investigators the breakup had not been mutual. Cora had begun planning a new life, distancing herself from Evan and eventually meeting the man she would marry. Evan, according to co-workers and acquaintances, struggled to accept the separation. He appeared calm in public, but continued showing up at places he knew Cora would be. The wedding invitation list did not include his name. 2 days before the reception, Evan visited the venue during business hours. Staff later told investigators he appeared composed and spoke briefly with a coordinator before asking to step into a rear service hallway. Security cameras captured him entering the corridor that led to storage rooms and utility panels servicing the ballroom. He remained out of view for several minutes. When he exited, nothing appeared disturbed. The lights along the railing continued to function normally. By early evening on May 21st, the ballroom was near capacity. The air conditioning maintained a stable indoor temperature despite the humidity outside. Guests stood along the perimeter of the dance floor, some resting their hands on the metal railing while watching. At 7:14 p.m., the couple began their first dance as approximately 30 guests gathered around the floor. Approximately 30 guests formed a loose circle around the floor. Midway through the song, Cora stepped backward. Video footage later showed her reaching her right hand behind her and placing it on the metal rail as she shifted her weight. Within a second, her posture changed. Witnesses stated that her arms stiffened and her body became rigid while in contact with the railing. She did not release her grip. Those nearby initially believed she had lost balance, but it quickly became apparent that she was unresponsive and unable to move. The music continued briefly before being stopped. Her groom moved toward her and attempted to pull her away from the railing. Upon contact, he immediately recoiled and fell backward onto the dance floor, conscious but disoriented. Several guests approached but paused, uncertain whether the railing was still unsafe to touch. Cora remained upright against the railing with sustained muscle contraction, unable to release her grip. Witnesses estimated the contact lasted several seconds before her knees gave way. When the connection ended, she fell directly onto the concrete floor. Staff disconnected power to the lighting circuit, after which guests moved in to assist. Emergency services were called immediately. CPR was initiated and continued by paramedics upon arrival, but no sustained rhythm returned. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be ventricular fibrillation due to electrical exposure. A burn on her palm and irregular circuit readings prompted investigation. The next morning, a forensic electrician examined the lighting system. Investigators found that multiple safety protections had been deliberately bypassed, allowing the metal railing to remain energized while appearing to function normally. The associated breaker had been obstructed, preventing shutdown. Toolmark analysis linked altered wiring to tools recovered from Evan Maddox's vehicle. Surveillance footage placed him in the service corridor within 48 hours of the incident. Investigators concluded the modifications were intentional. The ballroom closed temporarily for remediation. New ground fault protection was installed, bonding corrected, and the affected sub-panel replaced. Evan Maddox was charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued he deliberately disabled multiple electrical safeguards, creating a concealed hazard within the venue. Expert testimony established that the railing remained energized while appearing to function normally. Evan Maddox was charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued he deliberately disabled multiple electrical safeguards, creating a concealed hazard within the venue. Expert testimony established that the railing remained energized while appearing to function normally. A jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to life in prison. It was September 3, 2017, in Franklin County, Ohio. Evening settled over a quiet suburban street with clear visibility, mild weather, and little traffic. Porch lights lined the row of single-family homes as most residents remained indoors for a typical Sunday night. Harold Wynn, a 63-year-old local court official, had spent the day at home reviewing paperwork and preparing for the upcoming work week. He had spent years handling financial and civil cases and was nearing the later stages of a long career in the local court system. Records later showed he had recently presided over a fraud trial that resulted in Caleb Doyle, a 41-year-old defendant, receiving a prison sentence. Doyle had been released months earlier. Phone records later indicated Caleb Doyle remained resentful about the outcome of the case. Messages sent to an acquaintance suggested Doyle wanted a direct confrontation to challenge what he believed had been an unfair decision. That evening, Doyle drove alone to Wynn's residence, carrying a legally owned handgun. Traffic cameras confirmed a vehicle registered to Doyle entering the neighborhood and parking along the curb nearby. A neighboring home's doorbell camera showed Doyle walking up the driveway and stopping at the front door. The footage recorded repeated knocking. Inside the house, an interior foyer camera, part of a home security system, captured Wynn approaching and opening the door. The video showed Doyle stepping forward immediately after the door opened. The two men stood within a few feet in the entryway. Their body movements indicated a tense exchange. Within seconds, Doyle pushed inward, forcing his way into the foyer. The camera showed both men shifting as Wynn moved sideways, appearing to try to pass toward an adjacent hallway. Doyle's right arm lifted and the handgun became visible. Investigators later noted from footage review that his finger appeared positioned on the trigger as he moved closer. Wynn's movement brought them into direct contact, and the footage showed a brief struggle at close range, their upper bodies colliding and arms entangled. During that contact, a single gunshot discharged. Audio confirmed only one shot. Wynn staggered backward and fell onto the foyer floor. Doyle stepped away, lowered the weapon, and quickly moved back toward the front door. No additional shots or prolonged struggle followed, and the interior camera continued recording the silent entryway after he left the residence. Medical examination later determined the bullet entered Wynn's upper chest at close range, damaging lung tissue and major blood vessels. The injury caused rapid internal bleeding, and he lost consciousness within moments. A neighbor who heard the gunshot contacted emergency services, bringing deputies and medical personnel to the scene. Wynn was found unresponsive in the entryway and was pronounced dead after life-saving measures were attempted. Investigators recovered the handgun from the residence after Doyle abandoned it during the exit, and ballistic testing matched it to the recovered bullet. Security footage established Doyle's arrival, forced entry, struggle, and departure from the property shortly after the shot. Traffic cameras later tracked a vehicle registered to Doyle leaving the neighborhood. Digital records and travel data confirmed the visit was intentional and tied to the earlier court case, and authorities concluded the retaliatory confrontation escalated during the forced entry, leading to the fatal discharge. Caleb Doyle was located and arrested 2 days later following coordination between local detectives and regional patrol units. Initially charged with murder and armed intimidation, court proceedings later reduced the charge, and he was ultimately convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 16 years in state prison. The official report listed the cause of death as a single gunshot wound to the chest, sustained during a residential confrontation, supported by video evidence, ballistic results, and verified communication records. Investigators concluded that Harold Wynn died as a result of Doyle's retaliatory visit, escalating into a fatal close-range struggle inside the home. It was December 28, 2016, in an urban neighborhood in Pennsylvania. The air was just above freezing. Narrow streets flanked older 3-story apartment buildings with basement utility rooms. Raymond Keller, 58, owned 7 apartment buildings and often handled repairs himself to avoid contractor costs. Tenants described him as reluctant to spend on maintenance and unresponsive to complaints. One of those tenants, 37-year-old Luis Vega, had rented a 1-bedroom apartment for 5 years and had never missed a rent payment. In late August 2016, Luis underwent emergency surgery for a severe bacterial infection and remained hospitalized and sedated for 13 days. During that time, his September rent payment came due. On September 4th, with rent 4 days late, Raymond went to the apartment and found no one home. Rather than attempting to contact Luis or starting the legal eviction process, which typically takes weeks with proper notice and court hearings, Raymond changed the locks on September 5th. On September 6th, he hired day laborers to remove all of Luis's belongings, which were taken to a disposal facility and destroyed, including irreplaceable items like his deceased mother's jewelry, his father's military medals, and important documents. After discharge on September 10th, Luis returned to find an empty unit. Raymond refused to return belongings or his security deposit. Luis lost his job weeks later. By mid-November, he was sleeping in his car, homeless, and struggling through the cold fall weather. On a cold evening in late December, Luis watched Raymond enter one of his buildings around 6:45 p.m. with a tool bag. The building was a 3-story structure with 14 units and a basement housing laundry facilities and utilities. After waiting over an hour, Luis used an unlocked rear door that tenants used for trash disposal to reach the basement around 8:05 p.m. He found Raymond kneeling by an open electrical panel, replacing a circuit breaker, with tools spread on the floor. Luis confronted Raymond about the illegal eviction, demanding his belongings or compensation. Raymond dismissed him and told him to leave, or he would call authorities. What followed later appeared in the scene reconstruction. A blow with a metal pipe found leaning against the basement wall felled Raymond. drag marks and scuffs led approximately 30 feet to a small storage room where he was positioned inside. A heavy metal shelving unit stacked with paint cans and supplies was pushed against the door, which opened inward, preventing it from opening more than a few inches. Back at the panel, plier marks on 2 energized conductors showed a deliberate cross-contact had been forced. Sparks and heat ignited cardboard boxes and old paint-soaked rags stored improperly nearby. Within minutes, smoke collected at the ceiling and spread along wooden joists. Upstairs, a first-floor tenant later recounted smelling smoke around 8:48 p.m. and immediately calling for help. The building's smoke alarms activated at 8:50 p.m. In the basement, smoke pushed through the storage room door gap. Raymond regained consciousness, disoriented from the head injury, aware only of smoke filling the dark storage room. He struggled against the door but couldn't move the heavy shelving blocking it from outside. As alarms sounded upstairs and tenants evacuated, smoke and heat built rapidly around him. Fire crews arrived at 8:56 p.m. but couldn't reach the basement stairs until 9:21 p.m. due to heavy flames. They forced the door open at 9:24 p.m. and found Raymond collapsed near the threshold. Examiners later confirmed he died from smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning, with the head injury occurring before the fire began. Soot composition in Luis's car and on clothing later matched burned materials from the basement. Fingerprints were found on the pipe, the shelving unit, and the pliers at the electrical panel. Video from a nearby storefront captured Luis entering and leaving through the rear door within the window in which smoke first appeared. Witnesses from the shelter where Luis had stayed confirmed his ongoing anger toward Raymond over the illegal eviction. The death was ruled a homicide and arson. A court convicted Luis of first-degree murder and arson. He received life without parole. The building suffered heavy structural damage and was later demolished. It was July 19, 2016, at a crowded lake house near Lake Travis, outside Austin, Texas. Humid air drifted through the open windows, while boat lights reflected across the dark water outside. Inside the house, wet towels, beer cans, and fishing gear were scattered across the hardwood floors after a full day of drinking in the sun. Caleb Rowe was 27 years old and worked dock repair jobs around Austin. His friend group, Caleb, had a reputation for turning every weekend into some kind of joke. He filmed fake jump scares, dumped lake water on sleeping friends, and once zip-tied a buddy's cooler shut during a fishing trip just to record the reaction later. Most of it stayed harmless, but honestly, once alcohol got involved, the group usually stopped thinking about where the line actually was. In July 2016, several friends rented a small lake house outside Marble Falls to celebrate Caleb's birthday. By the second night, while everyone had been drinking for hours, grilling outside, they decided to mess with the birthday guy. Around midnight, 2 friends came up with the idea of spiking Caleb's sports bottle with ghost pepper puree, concentrated pepper extract, and blended habaneros while he slept on the sectional couch downstairs. The plan was simple: wake him up dehydrated, let him chug the bottle, then film the reaction while everyone laughed. They expected coughing, tears, maybe vomiting. Nothing more serious than that. Around 2:13 in the morning, Caleb's older cousin Tyler came back inside after fishing and started making instant ramen in the kitchen. As he poured near boiling water into a thick ceramic mug, 2 of Caleb's friends quietly shook Caleb awake on the sectional couch nearby, while everyone else waited, trying not to laugh. Half asleep, dehydrated, and still drunk, Caleb immediately grabbed the sports bottle beside him and took several huge swallows before he was even fully awake. Tyler had just set the steaming mug down on the coffee table moments earlier before turning back toward the kitchen. The reaction happened almost instantly. Witnesses said Caleb jerked upright so violently the bottle flew from his hands. Within seconds, he was coughing, gagging, and barely able to see through the tears. Still panicking, Caleb grabbed the nearest cup on the table beside him. It was Tyler's mug of still scalding ramen water. Without even looking, Caleb took a huge gulp, trying to kill the burning in his mouth from the pepper mixture. The reaction was immediate. Witnesses said Caleb jerked forward violently the second the water hit his throat. Instead of spitting it back out cleanly, he inhaled sharply mid-swallow while gasping for air. The near-boiling water and steam went deep into his throat and airway. Caleb dropped the mug as he stumbled backward. The ceramic shattered across the hardwood while he clawed at his neck with both hands. A choking sound came out of him that several friends later described as sounding wet and strained at the same time. Within seconds, saliva started pouring from his mouth while his coughing turned harsh and uneven. At first, a couple of friends still thought he was exaggerating because everyone had been laughing seconds earlier. But then, blisters began forming across Caleb's lips and the inside of his mouth. When he tried inhaling again, he suddenly coughed pink, blood-streaked fluid down the front of his chest. That was the moment the room stopped laughing. Witnesses later said Caleb's breathing changed terrifyingly fast. Every inhale sounded tighter and weaker than the last, while he struggled to pull air through the swelling in his throat. By the time paramedics arrived, he could barely speak and was starting to lose consciousness from lack of oxygen. Doctors placed him on a ventilator at the hospital, but the burns inside his throat and lungs kept swelling over the next several hours. He died the following afternoon from severe thermal airway injuries and respiratory failure. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental. Investigators determined the hot water and steam had severely burned Caleb's airway, and the panic inhalation forced some of the superheated liquid into his lungs. Over the next several hours, the damaged tissue continued swelling until he could no longer breathe. Two of Caleb's friends were later charged with reckless endangerment and criminally negligent homicide for the pepper prank. Investigators specifically stated Tyler was not blamed for leaving the mug on the table, since he had no involvement in the prank and believed the water was simply cooling beside the couch. It was May 22, 2014, along a two-lane stretch of rural highway in California's Central Valley. The road cut through flat farmland with long visibility and almost no traffic. By late afternoon, one vehicle would leave that road in a way that didn't match the conditions. And that's what makes this a disturbing case. Nothing here looked dangerous at first. Derek Nolan, 33, had just returned to seasonal farm work after a short break. He moved between jobs that most people avoided, known for getting things done, but also for reacting fast when pushed. People around him noticed the same pattern: short temper, quick escalation, and no hesitation when something set him off. He worked in places with long highways, open land, and fewer people around. Oversight was minimal. That kind of routine left gaps where things could happen without being noticed. Not far from one of those jobs, Thomas Velez, 58, ran a commercial beekeeping operation. He had decades of experience managing thousands of colonies and transporting them safely. Weeks earlier, Thomas's teenage son confronted Derek over stolen farm equipment. The argument escalated. Witnesses said Derek struck him with a hive tool. The injury didn't appear fatal at first, but the boy collapsed later that night and died from internal bleeding. The case was ruled accidental, and no charges were filed. After that, Thomas didn't confront Derek again. He continued working, but people around him said he became quieter. His routine stayed the same. That afternoon, Derek stopped at a roadside diner. His truck sat in an open gravel lot for over 30 minutes. Security footage showed normal activity. No forced entry, no visible disturbance. Near the vehicle, when he returned, nothing appeared out of place. Earlier that day, several beekeeping transport boxes had been reported missing from a nearby staging area. These boxes are used to hold active colonies during transport and can contain thousands of bees if opened. Derek got back on the highway. Within minutes, a driver behind him noticed the truck drifting slightly across the center line. It corrected, then drifted again. The movement became uneven, right, then sharply left. The vehicle stayed at speed, but there was no consistent braking pattern. Later, a large number of bees were found inside the cab, far more than what would normally end up there by accident. It pointed to the bees being released inside the vehicle while it was parked and unattended, turning the enclosed space into something chaotic once he got back in. With the windows closed, many of the bees ended up trapped inside the cab. As the truck picked up speed, they didn't clear out. They stayed inside, moving unpredictably in the confined space. The sting pattern showed heavy exposure to the face, neck, and upper chest. Medical findings indicated rapid swelling in those areas, along with pain and disorientation consistent with multiple stings in a confined environment. That level of exposure can interfere with breathing and significantly affect coordination. The truck left the road after a final overcorrection, dropped into a shallow embankment, and struck a fence. A nearby farm worker called emergency services within 2 minutes. Responders arrived about 11 minutes later, but had to wait briefly before approaching due to active bees inside the cab. Once the area was cleared, Derek was found unresponsive. The medical report listed the cause of death as blunt force injuries from the crash, with multiple bee stings identified as a contributing factor that impaired his ability to control the vehicle. No drugs were found in his system. No mechanical failures were identified. Investigators determined the bees and pheromone traces had been placed inside the vehicle before Derek returned. There were no signs of forced entry. Thomas Velas left the area weeks later. Equipment logs, purchase records, and forensic evidence tied the missing transport boxes back to his operation. He was later located out of state and arrested. He was charged with first-degree murder, vehicle tampering resulting in death, and use of a biological agent to cause harm. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. It was the winter of 2011 in a mid-sized Rust Belt city in western Pennsylvania. Old money there didn't look like much from the outside. Modest houses, sensible cars, savings built over 40 years at the same job. The kind of wealth accumulated slowly through steady work. Raymond Salt was 67 and had built a small commercial cleaning company into an operation with 14 employees and 3 municipal contracts. He was a widower with 2 children, a daughter, Cara, 39, and a son, Devin, 36. He had told both of them that everything he'd built would be split down the middle when the time came. Cara moved back after a divorce and gradually became Raymond's primary caretaker as his health declined. Devin lived 4 hours away and visited when distance allowed. 2 years in, Raymond was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia. His cognition declined unevenly, some weeks nearly normal, others noticeably impaired. Cara arranged a new estate attorney, one she selected, and accompanied her father to every appointment. Within months, Raymond signed a revised will. Cara received the business, the house, and nearly all liquid assets. Devin received a savings bond worth $4,000. He was not informed that the meeting had taken place. When the will was read, Devin sat silently in the attorney's office for several minutes. He later consulted 2 independent specialists who concluded that Raymond's cognitive state at the time of signing raised serious questions about his testamentary capacity. Devin filed a legal challenge. Cara retained an attorney and waited. A relative later arranged a family meeting, hoping to ease the conflict. In front of 3 people, Cara told Devin their father had known exactly what he was doing and that Devin should have been around more if he wanted to matter. Devin drove home that night and did not sleep. 7 months of legal fees had drained most of his savings, and the person he blamed for it had just smiled at him like the outcome was already settled. Devin knew the cleaning business operated out of a single-story equipment facility on the edge of an industrial lot. He had visited it with his father as a teenager and knew the electrical panel had been a recurring concern. Among his father's belongings was a spare key to the facility that Cara had never thought to retrieve. Cara worked late alone every Thursday for payroll. Devin arrived after dark and confirmed her car was already in the lot, interfered with wiring behind the main electrical panel, and fed a length of pipe through the exterior door's handle bracket, leaving the interior handle operable, but the door unable to swing outward under pressure. He drove away. The fire started at approximately 9:40 that night. The first responding crew reported flames visible through the front windows and smoke venting heavily through the roofline on arrival. The facility had one secondary access point at the rear. A firefighter who entered through it found Cara on the floor of the main storage room, closest to the jammed exterior door, the only exit she would have known. Investigators later noted the exterior door's handle bracket showed stress marks consistent with repeated forceful engagement from the inside. She had been conscious long enough to understand the door wasn't going to open. The medical examiner later determined that Cara died from a smoke inhalation and thermal injuries sustained during the fire. The fire was initially ruled accidental. 4 months later, a second review identified the pipe bracket and the wiring interference. Devin had used his own car, his father's key, and had called a friend from the road that night, in a state the friend described simply as hollow. That call was enough. He was arrested later that year and charged with first-degree murder and arson. Prosecutors showed that Devin had confirmed Cara was inside the building before blocking the exit, removing any argument that her death had been accidental. He was convicted on both counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole under Pennsylvania law. During sentencing, The judge noted that Devon's legal challenge to the will had not been without merit. An independent review during the trial found the revised will highly irregular, given Raymond's documented cognitive decline, and the estate would likely have been successfully contested within the year. It was September 14, 2019, at a small private marina along the Gulf Coast of Florida. The morning tide had just begun to rise, lifting the moored boats in slow, steady increments. Wooden docks creaked against their pilings as gulls circled overhead. The air was already warm, carrying the scent of salt and diesel. Most slips were quiet at that hour, with only a few early owners walking the planks to check their vessels before the day's heat set in. Oliver Garland, 48, had co-managed the marina for nearly 15 years. He handled maintenance schedules, billing, and dock assignments. Regular clients trusted him, but over the past year, changes in his personal life had begun to surface in subtle ways. His wife, Jessica Garland, 30, had grown distant. She had married Oliver at 23 when he was already established and financially secure. By the time she turned 30, she had begun spending more time around the docks, especially near Slip 27, where Matt Jackson, 28, kept his 38-foot cruiser. Matt was 20 years younger than Oliver and had purchased his boat the previous spring, becoming a frequent presence at the marina. His growing closeness with Jessica soon became noticeable to staff. Oliver discovered their messages in July, and by August, Jessica told him she planned to leave and move in with Matt after filing for divorce. Friends later said Oliver appeared unusually composed during that conversation. Matt followed a predictable routine. On Saturdays, he arrived shortly after 7 a.m. to check his mooring lines and rinse the deck before taking Jessica out on the water. He preferred inspecting the lines himself, often stepping into the narrow space between the hull and dock as the tide shifted. Security footage showed Oliver walking the docks alone before sunrise on September 14th and stopping at Slip 27. By 7:18 a.m., Matt arrived. Jessica followed in her car minutes later. Witnesses recalled her laughing as she walked down the dock toward him. The tide had begun to strengthen, and a larger fishing vessel passing the marina entrance created a moderate wake that rippled inward. Matt stepped into the narrow gap between the dock and hull to check the boat's position. Jessica stood several feet away on the planks. As the wake reached Slip 27, the boat shifted laterally. What would normally have been a restrained movement became a sudden surge inward. The hull pressed sharply toward the dock piling. Matt had no room to step back. The side of the vessel pinned him upright against the wooden structure. Witnesses described hearing a strained shout, followed by the heavy grinding sound of fiberglass against timber. Jessica moved toward him as others on the dock reacted. The pressure lasted only seconds, but the force was immense. When the vessel shifted back with the retreating wake, Matt collapsed onto the planks. Paramedics were called from a nearby station, but upon arrival, the injuries were assessed as immediately fatal. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death to be traumatic thoracic compression resulting in cardiac arrest. Multiple rib fractures and extensive internal hemorrhage were consistent with crushing between a fixed structure and a heavy vessel. Investigators reviewing dock footage noticed Oliver's early morning presence. Marine safety experts determined the line configuration at Slip 27 had been intentionally adjusted in a manner inconsistent with standard securing practice. The tide schedule for that morning showed predictable lateral force during the incoming surge. When confronted, Oliver did not request an attorney. In a recorded statement, he admitted altering the lines. He told detectives he knew Matt's routine and understood how the boat would respond once the tide strengthened. Said he believed the marina environment would make the death appear accidental. He also acknowledged knowing Jessica would be there to see it. Oliver Garland was charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that he weaponized his professional knowledge and exploited predictable tidal movement to carry out the act. Jessica later testified regarding the separation and Oliver's reaction. A jury convicted him, and he received a life sentence without parole. It was August 21, 2016, at a public boat launch on the northern edge of Coeur d'Alene's lake country, still covered in pre-dawn darkness. Temperatures hovered around 54 degrees Fahrenheit as light fog reduced visibility to roughly 30 feet. The gravel lot sat empty, and the slick wood plank dock extended into the water. The unstaffed ramp was open before sunrise, with no attendants or cameras present. Baxley Gort was 42 years old. He worked in regional supply logistics, a desk-heavy job he had held for nearly a decade. People who fished alongside him said he often arrived before sunrise and stayed longer than most, following a routine that rarely changed. He had been using this launch for about 3 seasons. Fishing was not casual for him. He kept a detailed log, tracked water temperature. He launched before sunrise, fished through the morning, and was usually back before the lot filled with weekend traffic. That routine had become a point of friction. Todd Harlan was 44, a self-employed contractor who lived less than 2 miles from the launch. He used the same ramp regularly and often arrived early to secure a position. Over roughly 2 seasons, multiple witnesses described seeing Gort and Harlan exchange words on at least 4 occasions over ramp access and dock positioning. The disagreements were not violent, but they were consistent and increasingly pointed. One regular later recalled Harlan remarking that Gort needed a wake-up call. Remembered after the incident, though, investigators noted the exact timing couldn't be firmly established. Harlan owned a full set of mechanical and cable tools through his contracting work. The dock and ramp had no cameras and no overnight security. Baxley arrived alone that morning before first light. He had mounted a GoPro to his dashboard earlier that season, likely to document launch conditions. That camera was running. The electric winch on his trailer was the mechanism he used to guide his boat into the water. The cable was braided steel, standard for the setup. When it engaged under load, it failed, not gradually. When the steel cable snapped under tension, the stored force recoiled toward the open driver's side. The open driver's door created a direct path. The recoiling cable entered through the open door and struck Gort across the face and neck. The GoPro did not clearly capture the exact trajectory, but it recorded the sudden recoil, a sharp impact sound, and the violent jolt that pulled him partly from his seated position. He collapsed against the doorframe and did not recover. Injuries documented during autopsy included severe facial fractures, a deep neck laceration with associated vascular injury, and internal hemorrhaging consistent with a high-velocity strike from a taut steel line. The medical examiner determined death occurred from rapid blood loss before help could arrive. No one witnessed the incident directly. No call was placed until another early morning user arrived and found him. When investigators reviewed the cable, the break pattern was inconsistent with fatigue or wear. Toolmark analysis indicated the cable had been partially cut while wound on the drum, enough to weaken inner strands while leaving the exposed section visually intact. The circumstantial link strengthened as toolmark analysis showed cuts consistent with tools of that type accessible to Harlan, while investigators reconstructed the timeline cautiously from movement records and witness accounts. Harlan was identified through those statements, his access to the tools, and his proximity to the location. When questioned, he acknowledged cutting the cable. He said his intention was for it to fail during launch, to damage equipment, not injure Gort. He described it as retaliation for repeated disrespect at the ramp. He was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter after prosecutors argued that deliberately compromising safety equipment where a person was foreseeably at risk constituted criminal recklessness regardless of intent. The GoPro footage was entered into evidence, and the weakened cable section was preserved as forensic evidence. Authorities concluded the death resulted from deliberate retaliatory sabotage designed to fail under load without warning. Todd Harlan was sentenced to 8 years in state prison. Baxley Gort's fishing logbook was found on the passenger seat, his final entry made the evening before. It was May 25, 2017, in a mid-sized city in Oregon. A light rain fell over downtown, glass towers reflecting a low, silver sky. Commuters moved through the grid in steady streams at the end of the workday. Scott Mercer was 38, a senior accountant at a regional manufacturing firm with a corner office on the 14th floor. In early spring, he had compiled documentation of millions in fraud across 2 fiscal years. After submitting evidence to federal authorities, an unannounced audit began in early May. His supervisor, Chief Financial Officer Vincent Kemp, 45, had personally authorized the fraudulent transactions and now faced prison time and career destruction. Scott kept a predictable routine. Arriving at 6:45 a.m. each day, he would immediately pour himself a large mug of cold brew coffee from a personal bottle he kept in the small kitchenette refrigerator. In late May, building security footage captured Vincent entering the 14th floor at 5:48 a.m., more than an hour before his usual arrival time. He wore latex gloves and spent 9 minutes in the kitchenette area before leaving. Vincent had used a syringe to inject approximately 150 milliliters of ethylene glycol directly into Scott's 32-ounce cold brew bottle. Ethylene glycol is sweet-tasting, colorless, and blends easily with coffee. The dose was carefully calculated. 100 to 150 milliliters is typically fatal to an adult, causing acute kidney failure and severe metabolic acidosis. Scott arrived at 6:45 a.m. to prepare audit materials before the federal team arrived at 9. He poured his contaminated cold brew into his desk mug and began working. Over the next 50 minutes, he drank nearly the entire mug, consuming approximately 24 ounces of the poison mixture. By 7:40 a.m., he felt nauseous with a pounding headache. Then his vision blurred, and he felt confused and disoriented. He stood to get water but felt dizzy and sat back down, breathing rapidly. By around 8:10 a.m., Scott's condition deteriorated sharply. The ethylene glycol had metabolized into highly toxic compounds that attacked his kidneys and nervous system. His breathing became labored. He reached for his phone, but his hands trembled uncontrollably. Within minutes, he lost consciousness and slumped forward onto his desk. A colleague arriving at 8:35 a.m. found Scott unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, his skin pale and cold. She immediately called 911. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes and rushed Scott to a medical facility where doctors initiated emergency dialysis and administered fompazole, an antidote for ethylene glycol poisoning. But the damage was extensive. Scott never regained consciousness and died at 12:17 p.m. from acute renal failure and cardiovascular collapse. Toxicology analysis detected lethal concentrations of ethylene glycol in Scott's blood, urine, and stomach contents. The cold brew bottle tested positive for contamination with a tiny puncture mark visible in the cap seal. Security footage showed Vincent entering the floor unusually early. His fingerprints were lifted from the refrigerator handle and the cold brew bottle itself, despite his use of gloves. Investigators discovered Vincent had purchased 2 gallons of Prestone antifreeze with cash 4 days prior. Parking lot footage captured his vehicle and license plate. A partially empty antifreeze jug and a 60-milliliter veterinary syringe recovered from a dumpster near Vincent's residence bore his fingerprints and tested positive for ethylene glycol residue. Phone records showed Vincent had called a veterinary supply company 3 days before, inquiring about large-capacity syringes. A handwritten note in Vincent's desk drawer contained calculations matching Scott's coffee bottle volume and lethal ethylene glycol dosage amounts. The death was ruled a homicide. Vincent was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. The company faced millions in fines and delisting from the stock exchange, and 3 other executives received prison sentences for their roles in the fraud. It was April 22, 2017, behind an apartment complex outside Kansas City, Missouri. Rain had been falling on and off all evening, leaving the abandoned rail corridor soaked with mud and standing water. Rusted freight cars creaked in the wind, while weak security lights barely reached the overgrown path beside the tracks. Devin Shaw was 24 years old and worked overnight warehouse shifts loading freight trucks outside the city. Online, though, he spent most of his free time filming prank videos with a few friends. The problem was that Devin's clips only got attention when the reactions looked real. The more frightened people seemed, the faster the videos spread. So over time, the pranks became more extreme. Fake break-ins, fake kidnappings, random clown ambushes filmed in parking lots and alleyways. Most of the videos featured strangers or friends who had no idea they were being recorded until afterward. One of the people who always ended up helping Devin film those videos was his younger cousin, Terry. Friends later said Terry looked up to Devin and wanted to be part of the prank page himself. So when Devin suggested filming a killer clown chase video inside an abandoned rail corridor near the apartment complex, Terry agreed immediately. Behind the apartments sat an old rail maintenance path locals often used as a shortcut between parking lots and nearby stores. The area was poorly lit and lined with chain-link fencing, rusted freight cars, weeds, and narrow drainage trenches running beside the tracks. Some sections had partially collapsed concrete, and rusted steel reinforcement bars were visible through cracks near the trench edges. After several days of rain, parts of the ground had become unstable beneath soaked plywood and weeds. The plan sounded simple. Terry would wear a cheap clown costume and chase Devin for a few seconds, while another friend recorded the reaction on a phone. Then, they would reveal the joke and upload the footage online. Around 11:40 that night, Devin entered the corridor wearing headphones after leaving a nearby convenience store. Terry stepped into the narrow pathway wearing the clown mask and dragging a fake foam axe against the metal fence. The scraping sound echoed through the corridor. At first, Devin actually laughed because he immediately realized it was probably another prank video. But Terry kept charging toward him, screaming and swinging the fake axe hard enough that Devin suddenly bolted deeper between the freight cars anyway. Witnesses later said the whole thing escalated faster than anybody expected once Devin started genuinely running. The cell phone footage shook violently as the friend recording sprinted behind them through the mud. Near the tracks, Devin reached what looked like a shallow drainage gap beside the fence. In reality, it was the weakened edge of one of the old maintenance trenches, hidden beneath weeds and water-soaked plywood. He jumped without slowing down. The concrete gave way the second his foot landed. Devin's leg dropped through first, twisting his body sideways before his chest slammed directly onto one of the exposed steel rods protruding from the collapsed trench wall. At first, Terry laughed because he thought Devin was exaggerating the fall for the camera. But then Devin tried speaking and only managed a wet, choking sound. Blood immediately started spreading through the rainwater beneath him. Witnesses later said Devin's breathing changed terrifyingly fast. Within less than a minute, blood was bubbling from the corner of his mouth, while every breath sounded weaker than the last. Paramedics arrived quickly, but Devin had already lost massive amounts of blood. He died shortly after reaching the hospital. The medical examiner later determined the steel rod had pierced his lung and torn a major artery beneath his collarbone during the fall. Investigators later recovered the cell phone footage from the friend recording the prank, which helped reconstruct the exact sequence of the chase and collapse. Authorities concluded Terry never intended to kill Devin, but prosecutors argued the prank became criminal when someone was chased through a dangerous industrial corridor while disguised and waving what appeared to be a real weapon. Terry eventually accepted a plea deal for criminally negligent homicide that included probation, community service, and a reduced jail sentence. It was November 3rd, 2015, in Columbus, Ohio. The apartment complex on South 4th Street looked quiet, with most residents inside as a cold front moved through. Nothing stood out that night, except a brief power drop that affected only one unit and then returned as if nothing had happened. Earlier that fall, Ethan Rivas, 22, had settled into a strict routine built around training, classes, and recovery as a junior on his college track team. His schedule rarely changed, which is why what happened next feels so calculated. That night, he returned to his apartment just after 9 p.m., unaware that earlier someone had tampered with the electrical panel outside his unit. Investigators later confirmed the breaker connected only to his apartment had been manually switched off. At 9:17 p.m., his power cut out. The hallway light stayed on, and no other unit was affected. It lasted only seconds, but it was enough to draw him to the door. The moment he opened it, two individuals forced their way inside from the stairwell. Everything happened quickly. Evidence showed Ethan was pushed back into his apartment almost immediately, with no signs of a prolonged struggle, suggesting he was overpowered before he could react or call for help. The injuries tell the rest of the story. He sustained multiple stab wounds to the torso and upper body, deep enough to hit major blood vessels. It wasn't instant, but it didn't take long. There were signs he tried to move early on. Marks on the floor showed some brief movement, but that slowed quickly as blood loss set in. A witness later reported seeing two individuals leave through the stairwell shortly after. At 9:41 p.m., a resident returning home noticed Ethan's door slightly open and called for help. Emergency responders arrived at 9:47 p.m. and found him unresponsive with severe blood loss. Medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death is hemorrhagic shock from multiple stab wounds. Toxicology showed he was fully sober and aware during the attack. At this point, it already feels targeted. And it was. Investigators identified the two suspects quickly using building surveillance and access records. Both were located within 24 hours and arrested the next day. At first, the case looked contained to what happened inside the apartment. But then, investigators started digging into Ethan's past, which made sense of why the brothers committed the crime. 2 years earlier, Ethan had been named in a case involving the assault and killing of a classmate. The case never reached trial. There wasn't enough evidence to hold him, so he was released, and over time, it faded from public attention. But it didn't fade for everyone. The victim in that case was the younger sister of Adrian and Louis Val. Once that connection came out, everything else started to line up. Investigators found searches, saved case files, and message exchanges showing the brothers had been tracking Ethan for months. What initially looked random turned into a clear pattern, watching his routine, learning his schedule, and eventually finding a way into his building. Even the power outage wasn't random. It was controlled and timed to draw him to the door at the exact moment they needed. Adrian and Louise Vale were charged with first-degree murder, unlawful restraint, and tampering with evidence. Prosecutors focused on the level of planning, the surveillance, the timing, and the execution. Adrian was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole, while Luis received a 35-year sentence based on his role. I know a lot of people felt the verdict wasn't fair. I've seen comments and even petitions asking for a lower charge, but in the end, they committed a crime and had to face the consequences. It was March 2016 in a mid-sized city in northern Ohio. A quiet residential neighborhood sat far from the main roads, where most residents kept to themselves. One of the small single-story houses had been occupied by the same resident for over 20 years, and aside from the occasional neighbor waving from a driveway, almost nobody came to visit. Harlan was 71 years old and had spent 4 decades working as a warehouse supervisor. He was not well liked. People who worked under him remembered him as someone who used his position to make others feel small. He targeted vulnerable employees, particularly young women in their first jobs, belittling them publicly in front of coworkers, denying them advancement, and making their daily routines miserable. When they resigned, he moved on without a second thought. By his late 60s, Harlan had retired and largely withdrawn from public life. He lived alone, drank regularly, and managed chronic acid reflux that had bothered him for years. He kept the same brand of antacid tablets in his kitchen cabinet and took them every morning without examining them closely, relying on habit and poor eyesight. His routine rarely changed, including a daily walk to a nearby diner where he sat at the same corner table and ordered the same breakfast. The staff there had known him for years. One of the people Harlan had targeted years earlier was Marta Selby, now 32. She had been 19 when she started working under him at a logistics warehouse. After 2 years of public humiliation and professional sabotage, Harlan publicly accused her of tampering with outgoing shipments. The accusation took 14 months to resolve, drained her savings, and during the proceedings, she lost custody of her 4-year-old daughter to a family member. Their relationship never fully recovered. In late 2015, Marta located Harlan through public records and spent several weeks observing his routine before approaching him as a former colleague passing through the area. He welcomed the visit without suspicion. She returned twice more, and on the third visit emptied his antacid bottle and replaced the tablets with a powdered sulfamic acid descaling compound purchased with cash from a cleaning supply store 2 towns over. The white powder resembled crushed antacid tablets closely enough that someone relying on habit and poor eyesight would not notice the difference. She returned the bottle to the cabinet and did not come back again. Harlan took his usual dose the following morning before leaving for the diner, swallowing the tablets with water as he always did. He felt a sharp, burning sting as he swallowed, but assumed it was a different batch. Within minutes, a burning sensation spread through his throat and chest, but he dismissed it as another flare of his chronic reflux and continued his walk to the diner. By the time he reached his usual table, the pain had worsened, and each sip of water made it sharper. A waitress who had served him for years noticed he was sweating heavily and gripping the table. He could not answer when she approached. Within the hour, the caustic damage to his esophagus had progressed enough that breathing became labored and painful. Harlan slid partially from his chair and grabbed the table for support. Two other customers moved toward him. His face was pale, his breathing shallow and irregular, and he was unable to speak. The waitress stayed beside him while another customer called for help. Harlan remained conscious throughout, aware of the people around him, but unable to respond. He was taken from the diner and died several hours later from severe caustic burns to his esophagus and upper stomach lining. The antacid bottle recovered from his kitchen tested positive for sulfamic acid, a descaling compound commonly used in industrial cleaning products. A cleaning supply store 2 towns over confirmed a cash purchase of the same product 10 days earlier by a customer matching Marta's description, supported by partial security footage. Neighbor accounts placed a woman matching her appearance at his home multiple times in the weeks before his death. Marta was identified, questioned, and charged with first-degree murder. Under Ohio law, the charge carried a mandatory sentence of 15 years to life, with the possibility of parole. Available records indicate trial proceedings were ongoing at the close of the period covered. It was November 12, 2017, in Helena, Montana. A low gray sky hung over the quiet residential block, the temperature hovering just above freezing. Behind a modest single-story home, a detached garage stood about 40 feet from the house, its siding faded by years of winter wind. Inside, tools lined pegboard walls, and a fluorescent bulb cast a pale light over a concrete floor stained by oil and sawdust. Tully Draft, 51, was a contractor known for steady renovation work and reliable routines. For more than 2 decades, he had followed the same pattern. Wake early, organize tools in the garage, start his truck, and head to job sites across Helena. Friends described him as methodical. He parked his 2008 pickup in the same position each night, nose facing the closed garage door, leaving only a few feet between the bumper and the interior wall. Raymond Pike, 52, had once been a close friend. Their relationship fractured after a failed business venture left Raymond owing Tully roughly $8,000. Attempts to collect the debt became heated. A voicemail preserved on Tully's phone captured Raymond's frustration, insisting he was done discussing the money and tired of being pressured. By early November, neighbors reported raised voices during driveway confrontations. Security footage later recovered from a neighboring property showed Raymond entering Tully's detached garage 3 days before November 12th. He remained inside for approximately 17 minutes. He carried no visible tools in or out, and nothing appeared missing afterward. The truck remained parked in its usual spot. Investigators would later determine that a device had been secured within the garage during that visit, concealed above the driver's usual path and designed to activate when the truck moved forward. On the morning of November 12th, Tully entered the garage shortly after 6:30 a.m. He started the engine and allowed it to idle briefly, as he often did in colder months. With the garage door closed, the interior dim, and the wall only a short distance ahead, he shifted into drive and eased the truck forward, moving only a few feet. As the truck rolled forward and made contact with the interior wall, a concealed device above the driver's side released a suspended steel blade that had been secured within the rafters. The weighted metal dropped under gravity, striking through the driver's side window as the vehicle moved. Tempered glass shattered inward. The blade entered the cabin and struck Tully in the chest before the truck fully stopped. A neighbor later reported hearing a dull impact, followed by shattering glass, but assumed something had fallen inside the garage. Several hours passed before a family member arrived and found the garage door still closed. After receiving no response to knocking, emergency services were contacted. Responders forced entry and discovered Tully seated behind the wheel, unresponsive, impaled by a suspended steel blade that had fallen into the driver compartment. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death a penetrating chest injury resulting in catastrophic internal hemorrhage. Crime scene analysis found that a heavy steel blade had been suspended from the garage rafters and positioned above the driver's path. Toolmark comparisons linked mounting hardware recovered at the scene to equipment seized from Raymond Pike's workshop under warrant. Surveillance footage confirmed Raymond's presence inside the garage days earlier. and financial records documented the unresolved debt between the two men, establishing motive and opportunity. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Raymond Pike was charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued the deliberate placement of the suspended blade showed calculated intent, relying on the predictability of Tully's morning routine. During trial, forensic specialists reconstructed the truck's limited forward movement and impact path, demonstrating that even minimal acceleration within the confined space would have produced fatal injury. The jury returned a guilty verdict after deliberation, and Pike was sentenced to life in prison under state guidelines. It was August 3, 2017, in the remote desert backcountry of southern Nevada, where a heat wave pushed temperatures past 105 degrees Fahrenheit under clear, dry skies. Gravel flats and unstable dry washes stretched for miles, rock formations blocked most signals, and limited maintained roads left travelers heavily reliant on shared off-road GPS routes. Elliot Vane, 48, a high-end property developer known for pushing fast desert projects, was overseeing construction of a remote luxury retreat miles beyond the nearest graded road. Confident in technology and focused on speed, he depended heavily on GPS navigation whenever he traveled off established routes. That morning, hoping to cut nearly an hour from the drive, he downloaded a shared GPX shortcut from a community off-road platform and imported it directly into his SUV's system. Months earlier, Vane had approached Tomas Rell, a 52-year-old desert guide whose family had lived and worked on the same land for generations. According to investigators, Vane presented complex legal documents as routine partnership agreements tied to the retreat. Rell later discovered the paperwork had quietly transferred ownership of his property, leaving him without his home, guiding routes, or long-standing livelihood. Friends said Rell was devastated and believed he had been deliberately tricked. Messages later showed he knew Elliot depended heavily on GPS trail data when traveling remotely. 2 days before the trip, Rell intentionally manipulated trail data on a popular off-road navigation platform. He uploaded a fabricated shortcut that looked legitimate, but secretly diverted drivers off the safe graded road into a dry wash notorious for trapping vehicles in soft sand. Investigators also found the mapped waypoint for a small, natural spring less than a quarter-mile away, normally included on community maps, had been deliberately removed. Investigators uncovered a second step. While Elliot's SUV sat unattended at a contractor yard earlier that week, security logs placed Rell near the vehicle. Examination later showed an aftermarket emergency SOS beacon had been tampered with. Investigators found the antenna cable inside the rear panel had been loosened rather than fully removed, preventing a signal while leaving the unit outwardly functional. Late that morning, dashcam footage recorded Elliot turning off the maintained road and following the uploaded shortcut into the wash. At first, the surface appeared firm. Several miles in, the sand softened dramatically. About 14 miles from the nearest road, the rear wheels spun and the SUV slowed. Repeated acceleration buried the tires until the vehicle became fully high-centered. Audio captured Elliot attempting forward and reverse until warning lights appeared and the engine overheated, forcing shutdown. Phone records showed he tried calling for help and activating the SOS system, unaware it had been disabled. No signal left the vehicle. Footprints later showed Elliot set out on foot with only his phone, a small bottle of water, and a light jacket. He followed the mapped route downstream, expecting it would reconnect to a road. Search teams later confirmed a small spring hidden in a narrow rock cleft less than a quarter-mile from his path, but it no longer appeared in the navigation data he was following. Temperatures that afternoon reached about 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Drone imagery later showed his tracks growing uneven before ending on exposed gravel roughly 900 feet beyond the spring. Investigators determined he likely collapsed there from dehydration and heat exposure. The medical examiner confirmed acute dehydration as the cause of death. On August 5th, co-workers reported Elliot missing. Search teams scanned desert routes until a drone operator reviewing earlier footage noticed a reflective object in a wash. Rangers located the abandoned SUV and followed footprints to Elliot's body later that day. Digital forensics traced the deceptive GPX route upload to Tomas Rel, confirmed he removed the spring waypoint, and linked him to tampering with the SUV's emergency transmitter. Investigators determined Rel altered the route and interfered with the emergency system as retaliation for losing his land, aware the desert conditions placed Elliot in extreme danger. Authorities ruled the death environmental exposure caused by intentional retaliatory actions that left Elliot stranded without navigation or emergency contact in severe desert heat. Tomas Rel was later convicted of manslaughter and felony tampering offenses and sentenced to 12 years in state prison. It was March 3, 2018, at a small regional airport in Montana. Morning light spread over snow-lined ridges. The tarmac lay open beneath a pale blue sky with light winds out of the west at about 8 miles per hour and temperature around 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Alan Crane, 44, co-owned a commercial real estate firm and often flew a single-engine Cessna to inspection sites. In January, he audited income streams and found underreported receipts and false maintenance expenses totaling millions in unreported income over several years. He confronted his partner, Dennis Briggs, 42, in mid-February. Dennis admitted to the fraud, but refused to file amended tax returns, stating it would cost hundreds of thousands in back taxes and potentially bankrupt the company. On March 1st, Alan told Dennis he would contact tax authorities regardless of consequences. Dennis knew he faced years in federal prison if Alan reported the fraud. Afterward, Alan scheduled a Saturday flight to Wyoming for site checks. The night before, someone accessed his tied-down aircraft around 8:45 p.m. A siphon removed roughly 18 gallons from the wing tank. The float arm on the fuel gauge sender was bent with a screwdriver, so the cockpit display would read 3/4 full when the tank held less than 1/4. Alan arrived at 8:15 a.m. His pre-flight focused on the standard walk-around, checking control surfaces, tires, and engine oil, along with visually checking the cockpit's fuel indicator. It showed approximately 3/4 full, what appeared to be plenty for the 320-mile round trip with normal reserves. He did not physically dip the tank with a measuring stick, relying on the gauge as he typically did when it showed adequate fuel. The engine run-up was clean with all instruments appearing normal. He lifted off at 8:51 a.m. and climbed to 9,500 feet, cruising over timbered slopes and long, white meadows. For over an hour, the aircraft ran normally. The gauge descended in a way that appeared consistent for that flight profile. At about 10:10 a.m., the engine went rough, then smoothed briefly. Alan checked his instruments and saw the gauge showing just over 1/4 full. The nearest airport was 42 miles to the southeast. He turned toward that airfield and reduced power to conserve fuel. 6 minutes later, at 10:16 a.m., the engine sputtered more severely. At 10:19 a.m., the engine quit completely as the fuel supply was exhausted. Alan radioed a mayday with his position and altitude and began a best glide descent at approximately 75 miles per hour, descending at about 700 feet per minute. From 9,500 feet, he had roughly 12 minutes of glide time. Terrain around him rose in ridge lines. A thin meadow lay ahead in a valley, but the glide path came up short as the terrain rose toward him. At approximately 10:28 a.m., he was still 400 feet above the clearing when treetops clipped the aircraft at about 65 miles per hour. The impact tore off the left wing and spun the fuselage violently. The aircraft crashed into the ground and tumbled approximately 90 feet through brush and rocks before coming to rest on its side. Two hikers a little over a mile away heard the engine's tone drop and then a heavy thud. They reached the site about 32 minutes later and used a satellite phone to relay coordinates. Alan had died on impact. The rapid deceleration caused his brain to impact his skull with fatal force, his ribs to break and puncture vital organs, and massive internal bleeding, forces the human body cannot survive. Examination showed the tank empty and the fuel gauge sender arm deliberately bent to give a false reading with fresh tool marks. The ground beside the tie-down spot bore fresh fuel staining. Phone records placed Dennis near the airport the night before. Security footage from a nearby gas station captured his truck passing toward the airport and again heading away. A siphon pump recovered from his garage tested positive for aviation fuel traces, and his fingerprints were found on the aircraft's fuel tank access panel. The death was ruled a homicide. Dennis was convicted of first-degree murder and received life in prison without parole. Greed had driven Dennis to sabotage his partner's plane. But in Texas, a father's rage was building over something far more personal: his daughter's assault and the manager who had buried the truth. It was September 14, 2017, at a riverside rental house outside Chattanooga, Tennessee. Warm air from the Tennessee River drifted through the open patio doors, while music echoed across the backyard from a Bluetooth speaker in the kitchen. Empty beer bottles and wet footprints from the river still covered parts of the floor. Jonas Lee was 25 years old and worked landscaping jobs with his older cousin during the week. He was quieter than most of his friends, the kind of guy who usually laughed things off instead of starting arguments. Around somebody like Louis Garner, that usually meant becoming an easy target. Louis treated every gathering like a prank challenge. He hid dead crickets in people's shoes, jumped out wearing masks, and once staged a fake break-in with a toy handgun that nearly sent one of his roommates through a sliding glass door. Most people laughed afterward because that was just what everyone expected from him. But honestly, living around somebody constantly trying to scare people probably gets exhausting fast. A week before the river trip, Louis uploaded another prank video online. It showed Jonas asleep on the couch while Louis dragged a fake blood-covered knife across his throat and screamed loud enough to wake the entire house. The clip spread through their friend group within days. During the weekend river trip, Jonas finally decided to prank Louis back. Earlier that afternoon, he and two roommates bought a realistic retractable stage knife from a costume store outside Chattanooga. The blade was designed to slide back into the handle on contact, creating the illusion of a stabbing. Before the prank happened, though, the knife slipped off the kitchen counter and hit the tile floor hard. One friend tested it quickly against his palm and saw the blade still retracting, so everyone assumed it was fine. Investigators later found the impact had cracked part of the internal spring mechanism, leaving a small section of the metal tip exposed if pressure hit the blade at the wrong angle. Nobody noticed the damage. Late that night, Louis sat near the kitchen island, drinking beer while scrolling through music. Jonas crept up behind him while another roommate secretly recorded from across the room. The prank worked almost perfectly. Jonas jabbed the prop knife into Louis' side, sending him stumbling backward before realizing there was no pain. The room exploded with laughter once Jonas revealed the retracting blade, and that should have ended the whole prank game, but instead, Louis grabbed the knife and started joking about using it on someone else next. A few minutes later, Jonas stepped onto the back patio, while Louis followed behind him, holding the same prop knife. Then, everything went wrong at once. Louis lunged forward jokingly at the exact moment Jonas stepped sideways into the fake stab. The damaged blade jammed partially open instead of collapsing. The exposed metal tip slipped between Jonas's ribs and drove deep into his chest. Witnesses later said Jonas actually laughed for another second before his expression changed completely. Even after being stabbed, he still thought it was part of the joke. Then blood started pouring through his fingers. The blade had pierced part of his heart and damaged major blood vessels near his lung. Jonas tried speaking, but only managed a choking sound before collapsing against the sliding door frame. At first, one roommate still thought he was pretending because the entire night had been built around fake panic and reactions. Then, Louis grabbed the wound, and blood immediately spread across his hand. That was the moment the room stopped laughing. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Jonas lost consciousness before they could stabilize him. He died shortly after reaching the hospital. Authorities later charged Louis with reckless homicide. Investigators said there was no evidence Louis realized the prop knife had been damaged after the earlier fall, but prosecutors argued he acted recklessly by continuing to use it during another prank. He eventually accepted a plea deal with a reduced prison sentence, while Jonas's family later filed a wrongful death lawsuit over the incident. It was August 18, 2018, on Angeles Crest Highway in California. Traffic was light, the air dry, and visibility clear along the mountain curves. By early evening, small groups had gathered at pull-offs, watching cars move through the canyon at speed, something that had quietly become routine in that area. Earlier that year, Kyle Mercer, 24, had built a small online following by posting high-speed driving clips on public roads. He worked part-time at an auto detailing shop and spent most of his income modifying his car. People around him noticed a pattern. He drove harder when others were watching and took more risks on roads he already knew well. Months earlier, one of his runs ended in a crash that killed a mother and her child. The The investigation was still ongoing, but he continued driving. That same summer, Aaron Blake, 39, was trying to rebuild his life after losing his wife and daughter in that crash. He was a certified mechanic and had detailed knowledge of braking systems, how hydraulic pressure moves through lines, and how small changes can lead to failure. The case had not yet reached court. On August 18th, a public car meet was held near the base of the canyon. Dozens of vehicles filled the lot. Kyle's car stood out, parked with the hood open. Aaron moved through the area, stopping briefly at different vehicles, blending in with others looking at modifications. Security footage later showed him standing beside Kyle's car for several minutes while Kyle was away. No one intervened. The area was crowded, and people moved in and out constantly. By the time Kyle returned, nothing appeared out of place. That evening, Kyle drove into the canyon with 2 other cars trailing behind. The road was dry, but the descent ahead included tight turns and limited guardrails. Drivers familiar with the route typically slowed before entering the sharper bends. Witnesses saw Kyle accelerating downhill. His brake lights appeared briefly, then disappeared. The car continued its speed as it approached a hairpin turn where most drivers reduced significantly. I've been here once, and I can tell you, they're not forgiving. Tight turns, steep drops, and you really feel how much you depend on your brakes working exactly when you need them. As he entered the curve, the vehicle failed to slow. The front dipped slightly, indicating brake pedal input, but there was no sustained deceleration. Tire marks later showed only a short, uneven skid before the car crossed the center line. Witnesses at a nearby turnout saw the car continue straight past the turn. It struck the edge barrier, which failed under the impact. The vehicle went over the side and dropped approximately 400 feet down the slope, rolling multiple times before coming to rest against rocks. Part of the fall was captured on a phone recording from above. The car rotated repeatedly, shedding panels as it descended. There was no visible correction after the initial loss of braking. Emergency services were called immediately, with the first call logged at 6:42 p.m. Due to the terrain, responders required time to reach the site. Fire crews and paramedics arrived at the base after about 22 minutes using a service access path. Kyle was found inside the vehicle, restrained but severely injured from repeated impacts during the descent. The car showed significant structural collapse in the front and roof areas. There were no signs of fire, but fluid leakage was present near the engine compartment. The coroner listed the cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries, consistent with high-speed impact and repeated rollover. Mechanical inspection focused on the braking system. Investigators found a loss of hydraulic pressure caused by tampering with a brake line connection, which prevented proper force from being transferred when the pedal was applied. The failure would not have been obvious during normal driving until sustained braking was required. Based on the evidence, investigators determined the braking system failure occurred before the vehicle reached the curve. The findings indicated deliberate interference rather than gradual wear. Surveillance. Footage from the meetup confirmed that Aaron Blake had access to the vehicle shortly before the drive. The motive was linked to the earlier crash involving Kyle. Investigators concluded the brake tampering was a targeted act carried out using Aaron's technical knowledge and access during the meetup. Aaron turned himself in 4 days later. He was charged with second-degree murder and felony vehicle tampering resulting in death. He was later convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. It was June 2017 on the outskirts of a mid-sized city in coastal Georgia. The apartment complex sat on a tree-lined street in a part of town that stayed quiet on most nights. Units turned over regularly and neighbors rarely learned each other's names. Curtis Habb was 38 years old and worked as a freelance IT contractor, mostly remotely, which meant he rarely had a reason to leave before noon. He kept irregular hours, drank heavily most evenings, and took prescription sleep medication before bed without variation. He was charming in casual settings, but people who knew him longer told a different story. He used his size to intimidate, dismissed complaints from women as overreactions, and leveraged professional connections to discredit anyone who challenged him. 2 years earlier, a woman had filed a formal complaint against Curtis in another state. She was 21. Had known him through a shared workplace, and watched her case dismissed after his attorney introduced her prior mental health records into the proceeding. The woman was Dalton Pruitt's younger sister. Following the dismissal, she left her job, withdrew from daily life, and moved back into her parents' home. She was still there when Dalton relocated to Georgia. Dalton was 29 and worked nights at a distribution center. He found Curtis's rental listing through a shared housing platform and responded directly. Curtis had no reason to connect him to anyone from his past. Dalton moved into the spare room in early 2017 and said little about himself. Over the first 2 months, Dalton observed Curtis's nightly routine without deviation. Curtis drank 4 to 6 beers most evenings, took a sleep tablet around 11, and was deeply unconscious by midnight. He also noticed that on nights Curtis drank less, his sleep was lighter. On the chosen night, Dalton left an extra 6-pack in the shared refrigerator without comment. Curtis finished most of it before taking his tablet and going to bed. Investigators later focused on Dalton's movements that night. Records showed he had purchased a large roll of industrial plastic wrap from a hardware store 3 towns over, paying cash. Based on Curtis's condition and the timing of Dalton's movements, investigators believe Dalton may have entered Curtis's room sometime after midnight. Their reconstruction suggested the plastic wrap could have been pulled tightly across Curtis's face and layered repeatedly, sealing over his mouth and nose and preventing him from drawing in air. Given the alcohol and sleep medication in his system, Curtis would likely have been unable to fully resist. His breathing would have grown increasingly shallow over the next several minutes before stopping entirely. Investigators believe the material was later removed and discarded before Dalton left the apartment around 2:15 that morning. The following afternoon, shortly after 2 p.m., Dalton told investigators he had not seen Curtis leave his room all day. He said he knocked on the bedroom door and, after receiving no response, opened it. Curtis was lying in bed and unresponsive. Dalton called for assistance and waited outside the building. Curtis's death was initially attributed to respiratory depression caused by the combined effect of alcohol and prescription sleep medication, consistent with his documented habits and toxicology results. Dalton cooperated with investigators and provided a calm account of the previous evening. No physical evidence was found in the apartment. Several weeks later, a forensic consultant reviewing the case noted subtle petechial hemorrhaging around Curtis's eyes, findings that did not fully align with medication and alcohol-related respiratory depression alone. Investigators reviewed Dalton's movements and traced a cash purchase of industrial plastic wrap at a hardware store to a customer matching his description, supported by partial footage from a nearby camera. His attorney successfully challenged the footage as insufficient for identification and argued the forensic findings were still consistent with natural causes given Curtis's documented habits. Without physical evidence from the apartment or the disposal site, investigators could not establish what had happened inside Curtis's room that night. The case eventually stalled. Dalton was never formally charged, and the death was later reclassified as undetermined within the period covered by available records. It was October 16, 2015, when a high school pep rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma turned fatal. The gymnasium held more than 400 students. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reflecting off polished hardwood as music echoed against painted concrete block walls and exposed rafters. Rexel Mund, 17, was a varsity football player known as much for intimidation as athletic skill. Multiple bullying complaints had followed him for 2 years, none resulting in meaningful discipline. He thrived on spectacle and forcing laughter at someone else's expense. 2 months earlier, he cornered Jonah Hale in the cafeteria, shoved him onto a table, and mocked him while someone filmed. The video spread within hours. Jonah, 16, was a quiet stage crew volunteer responsible for lighting and equipment. School records documented escalating hostility. 3 days before the rally, Jonah sent a message indicating that Rexel would not be laughing at the event. Due to the gym's high ceiling and suspended lighting grid, the school rented a compact articulating boom lift. The unit relied on 4 hydraulic outriggers secured by steel locking pins. Although the system used sensors to detect extension, elevation could still proceed if a pin appeared engaged but was not fully seated. Manufacturer guidance warned that incomplete engagement could lead to lateral instability under load. Security footage showed Jonah arriving early. Approximately 20 minutes before the rally, cameras captured him kneeling at the rear right outrigger. He shielded his hands from view while working near the stabilization assembly. Investigators later determined the locking pin had been deliberately tampered with prior to elevation, compromising the lift's mechanical stabilization despite appearing engaged. The pin was later recovered near the staging area, bent and marked. Students filled the bleachers shortly after 3. Rexel stepped into the lift basket with 2 other captains. Platform measured roughly 4 by 3 feet, enclosed by a waist-high guardrail. A brief visual check showed all outriggers deployed. From a distance, nothing appeared wrong. The boom arm elevated smoothly to about 8 feet. Music swelled. 2 students recorded from opposite sides of the gym. Rexel raised his arms and leaned back against the rail, hyping the crowd. 1 captain shifted toward him. The combined movement transferred weight toward the compromised stabilizer. Under load, the unsecured outrigger retracted several inches. The base dropped and pivoted. The basket swung violently sideways. Rexel was thrown clear. He fell approximately 8 feet, striking shoulder first before his head hit the hardwood. In the same motion, the destabilized boom arm clipped a suspended lighting bar that had not yet been secured with its secondary safety cable. The bar tore free and fell, striking him across the chest. Staff reached him within seconds. Emergency services arrived within 8 minutes. He never regained consciousness. Surgeons later confirmed fatal blunt force head trauma compounded by severe thoracic injuries from the falling lighting assembly. Inconsistent with accidental mishandling and consistent with deliberate interference prior to loading. Tool residue from stage storage matched markings on the metal. Prosecutors emphasized that disabling a critical stabilization component after reviewing manufacturer warnings demonstrated knowing exposure to a lethal risk in a crowded gym. Surveillance footage established Jonah's exclusive proximity during setup. The text message provided context. Investigators concluded the act was not impulsive sabotage, but a calculated decision to create instability under load. An outcome predictably dangerous, anyone elevated. Jonah Hale was arrested 4 days later and charged with second-degree murder. His defense cited prolonged bullying and emotional distress. Prosecutors presented forensic findings, the altered pin, and the message sent days earlier as evidence of intent. Following proceedings in juvenile court, he was adjudicated delinquent on the reduced charge of second-degree manslaughter and committed to a juvenile facility under state sentencing guidelines. It was April 11, 2016, in Baltimore, Maryland. The day had been mild with overcast skies and light afternoon rain that left sidewalks damp and visibility slightly muted by early evening. Inside a small private medical office building, the corridors were quiet as staff prepared to leave. Fluorescent hallway lights reflected off polished tile floors, and security cameras monitored the entrances, hallways, and the concrete stairwell connecting the upper offices to the ground level. Dr. Leonard Kess, a 57-year-old physician, was finishing paperwork in his second-floor office. He had worked in the building for years and maintained a steady patient schedule, often staying late to complete paperwork after appointments. In recent months, several families had raised concerns about delayed diagnoses connected to his care. While no formal ruling had been issued against him, the complaints had created tension and occasional confrontational messages sent to his office. One of those messages came from Aaron Madsen, a 35-year-old man who believed the doctor's treatment decisions had contributed to his sister's death earlier that year. Records later showed repeated emails accusing the physician of responsibility and warning that he would confront him in person if answers were not given. Near closing time that evening, Aaron Madsen entered the building unannounced and walked upstairs while most tenants were already leaving. Security footage later showed Madsen waiting in the hallway outside the doctor's office. When Dr. Kess stepped out carrying a folder and preparing to leave, Madsen approached him directly. The camera captured a brief exchange in the corridor. Investigators later noted Madsen moved closer and deliberately positioned himself between the doctor and the exit while confronting him about his sister's death. Dr. Kess then turned toward the nearby stairwell, appearing to try to leave the area rather than continue the interaction. As the doctor reached the stairwell entrance, Madsen followed and grabbed his arm. Footage shows a brief struggle lasting only seconds. During that contact, Madsen shoved him forward with enough force to push him toward the stair edge. The doctor lost balance immediately and fell down approximately 12 concrete steps. His back and shoulders struck multiple steps on the descent before his head impacted the wall at the lower landing. He came to rest motionless at the bottom of the stairwell. Madsen remained at the top momentarily before descending the stairs and placing a call to emergency services. Building occupants nearby later reported hearing a rapid sequence of impacts, followed by silence. Emergency responders arrived and found Dr. Kess unconscious with severe head trauma. He was transported to a nearby hospital, where medical assessment confirmed a traumatic brain injury, along with significant cervical spine damage consistent with a high-force fall onto a hard surface. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Investigators reviewed the hallway and stairwell camera recordings, confirming that a single retaliatory shove occurred and that no weapon was used. Digital records recovered from Madsen's phone and email account showed prior messages expressing anger and intent to confront the doctor over his sister's death. Authorities determined that the fatal injuries resulted directly from the fall, triggered by the physical shove near the stair edge. Shoe scuff marks on the stair lip and the doctor's dropped folder on the upper landing matched the sequence seen on video. Local prosecutors charged Aaron Madsen with involuntary manslaughter, citing reckless assault during a retaliatory confrontation that created a foreseeable risk of serious harm in a confined stairwell environment. The official report concluded that the confrontation escalated from an intentional grievance-driven encounter and that the doctor's death was caused by blunt force head trauma and spinal injury sustained during the fall. Investigators also noted that the building's security system preserved uninterrupted footage, allowing the event timeline to be reconstructed without gaps or conflicting witness accounts. Dr. Leonard Kess died at age 57 inside the office building, where he had practiced for years. Investigators confirmed the sequence through camera evidence, medical findings, recovered digital messages, and physical traces at the stairwell. Aaron Madsen was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in state prison. It was September 24, 2016, in a suburban neighborhood in Arizona. The streets were quiet before sunrise, rows of low-rise apartments set back from a 4-lane arterial. Warm, dry air moved over the asphalt as commuters started their day. Dustin Vasquez was 31, an automotive technician who rode his motorcycle to a local shop for the 6 a.m. shift. He had been dating Cassie for 3 months. She had ended a 5-year relationship with Craig Melton, 35, a former mechanic now in construction. The breakup had been Cassie's decision after Craig's drinking worsened. Craig had tried multiple times to reconcile, but Cassie blocked his number and made clear she wanted no contact. Neighbors saw Dustin's bike parked outside Cassie's unit several nights each week. In the weeks before the crash, an unfamiliar pickup was noted idling in the area after midnight. By late evening on a Tuesday, Dustin parked his motorcycle along the back row of the lot as usual. The illumination there came from 2 aging fixtures that left long gaps of darkness between cars. At around 2 a.m., a man moved quickly between vehicles, crouched at the bike, and left within minutes. No alarm sounded. Nothing appeared out of place from a casual glance in the pre-dawn light. Dustin rolled out at 6:45 a.m. Neighborhood stops worked normally, the brake lever firm at each sign. As the route opened, speed crept from 25 to 45 miles per hour and then higher. At 7:02 a.m., he merged onto the highway, settling in the right lane at about 65 miles per hour. Ahead, a construction zone compressed lanes. Traffic began slowing as brake lights flared down the line. Dustin squeezed the lever. It traveled nearly to the grip with little resistance. He pumped it, brief pressure, then nothing. The compression fittings had been loosened approximately 2 full turns on both circuits, and brake fluid had been seeping out gradually since leaving the lot. The shoulder was narrow and blocked by a continuous concrete barrier. A box truck up ahead slowed to about 25 miles per hour. Dustin, still near 58 miles per hour, leaned right toward the painted edge, then ran out of pavement. His front tire struck the truck's rear at approximately 54 miles per hour. The bike pitched, and Dustin vaulted forward over the handlebars. He traveled roughly 30 feet through the air before striking the pavement. A woman in an SUV 3 cars back later described a high, sharp, metallic hit. A figure in dark gear tumbling across 2 lanes, then a helmet sliding along the lane stripe. A construction worker ran across the closed lane and held traffic back. Dustin was pronounced dead at the scene. The primary injuries were fatal head and spinal trauma. At highway speed, the body decelerated so fast that the brain struck the inside of the skull with enough force to cause massive bleeding and swelling, while the spine fractured in multiple places, severing the spinal cord, despite the helmet protection. When the motorcycle was examined where it came to rest, technicians found both brake line fittings loosened by approximately 2 full turns each, with fresh tool marks and fluid streaking the frame. Back at the apartment, an oily stain beneath the overnight parking spot matched brake fluid that had dripped slowly for hours. Witness statements put a pickup in the complex area around 2 a.m. for several nights that month. Security footage from a nearby convenience store captured a similar truck parking in the lot between 1:47 a.m. and 2:23 a.m. Investigators matched wrenches recovered from Craig Melton's toolbox to compression nut marks on the fittings. Residue from his truck bed tested positive for brake fluid. When questioned, Craig initially denied being near the complex that night. After evidence was presented, he admitted loosening the fittings during the early morning hours, claiming he only wanted to scare Dustin and didn't think it would actually kill him. The death was ruled a homicide. A court convicted Craig of first-degree murder, and he received life in prison without parole.